All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're going deep, deep, deep into one of the most fascinating periods in American history.
Oh, absolutely.
The transition from post-Watergate all the way to the rise of Reagan.
Yeah.
So we're talking Ford, Carter, and that huge conservative wave that, well, that really kind of changed everything.
Really did. It set the stage for so much of what we see in politics today.
It did. It absolutely did. So we're basically taking a chapter straight out of a history textbook
Right.
and unpacking it all the drama, the scandals, the economic turmoil, the global shifts, the whole nine yards.
And trust me, there's a lot to unpack. This is like a political thriller, full of twists and turns.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. It's the 1970s. America's still kind of reeling from Watergate, right?
Yeah.
Nixon's out, and Gerald Ford, he's stepping into a role that, well, let's face it, nobody really wanted at that point.
It was a tough time to be president, that's for sure. I mean, imagine trying to restore public trust after a scandal like Watergate.
Yeah, huge challenge.
Yeah.
But then he pardons Nixon.
Yeah, and that really backfired, didn't it? I mean, it looked like he was letting Nixon off the hook,
It did. And it just fueled that cynicism that people were already feeling about Washington.
Absolutely. It just confirmed their worst suspicions. And on top of that, Ford had to deal with a struggling economy.
Oh, right, stagflation. I remember learning about that in school.
High inflation, high unemployment. It was a nightmare scenario.
The total mess. And then along comes Jimmy Carter, promising honesty, a fresh start.
He was seen as an outsider, a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. He seemed different, focused on ethics, energy, appointed more minorities and women to government positions.
He definitely shook things up, and he made human rights a central part of his foreign policy, which was a pretty big change.
It was a new approach. But then, bam, the energy crisis hits.
Yeah, that second oil crisis was brutal. OPEC jacked up prices again, and it led to gas shortages, long lines at the pumps, and it just made inflation even worse.
So it was like one step forward, two steps back. And then there was that malaise speech. Not exactly a pep talk, was it?
It wasn't. He was trying to be honest about the challenges facing the country, but it came across as a little too doom and gloom,
It did. Especially with everyone already feeling down about the economy.
Yeah, people were looking for some hope, some inspiration, and that speech didn't really provide it.
It didn't. But Carter did have a big win on the foreign policy front. The Camp David Accords.
Oh, absolutely. That was a major achievement, bringing together Israel and Egypt. I mean, these were two countries that had been at war for decades.
It's incredible when you think about it.
And to get them to sign a peace treaty, I mean, that was a huge win for diplomacy and for peace in the Middle East.
A high point for sure.
Yeah.
But then things start to unravel in other parts of the world, like Iran. And this is where it gets really complicated.
Yeah, Iran, it's a prime example of how foreign policy decisions can have these long-term consequences that you just don't see coming.
Right, like unintended consequences.
Exactly. So for years, the U.S. had supported the Shah of Iran, even though he was a brutal dictator and his own people hated him.
So we were essentially backing a tyrant.
Yeah, pretty much. And it all blew up in our faces when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979. Ayatollah Khomeini took over, and the Shah was out.
And then Carter lets the Shah into the U.S. for medical treatment. I mean, that really infuriated Khomeini's followers, right?
It did. They saw it as proof that the U.S. was still meddling in their affairs, protecting this guy they despised. And that's when they stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took those Americans hostage.
The Iran hostage crisis. It was a huge blow to America's image.
It was. It became the symbol of American weakness, and it dragged on for over a year.
More than a year. Just a nightmare situation.
Yeah.
And on top of all that, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan that same year.
1979 was a rough year.
Yeah, no kidding. What were the Soviets thinking with that move?
Well, they were trying to prop up a communist government there that was fighting against Islamic rebels.
Right, but Carter saw it as a power grab.
He did, absolutely. And he responded with sanctions, boycotts. He even started supporting those Afghan rebels.
So, in a way, we were indirectly helping the same groups that would later become the Taliban.
It's complicated, but yeah, in a way. The goal was to counter Soviet influence, but it shows how these interventions can have these unintended consequences that can really come back to haunt you.
Yeah, you really have to think about the long game.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got all this drama going on overseas, but meanwhile, here at home, there's another kind of revolution brewing. the rise of conservatism.
Right, and this is fueled by a lot of things. Economic anxiety, social and cultural shifts, and this growing sense that, liberal policies just weren't working anymore.
People were looking for something different.
They were, and you had these intellectuals, the neoconservatives, who were arguing that things had gone too far, They wanted smaller government, lower taxes, a tougher stance against the Soviet Union.
And the religious right starts gaining real momentum, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Evangelical Christians become a major force in politics.
They really did.
They were mobilized around these issues like abortion, school prayer, what they saw as a decline in traditional family values, and groups like Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority. They were key in getting those conservative voters registered and engaged.
So you've got all this happening at once. Economic uncertainty, global tensions, and this surge of conservative energy. It really felt like a turning point in American history.
It was. The ground was shifting and people were looking for a new direction. And that's what opened the door for Ronald Reagan. It's really amazing how Reagan was able to capture that feeling, that desire for change that was in the air.
Oh, yeah. He was a brilliant communicator.
He really was.
He blended this optimism and patriotism with, I don't know, a kind of nostalgia for what a lot of people saw as a simpler time.
Exactly. And people were tired,
Yeah.
tired of feeling like America was losing its way both economically and on the world stage.
Yeah, like we were slipping.
Right. And he offered this vision of a strong, proud America.
And it resonated, especially with those who felt like they'd been left behind by all the changes happening in society and the economy.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. This was a time when the manufacturing sector was declining. Blue-collar workers, they were really struggling.
Right, it was a tough time for a lot of folks. And then you had all these cultural anxieties bubbling under the surface.
Oh, yeah.
And Reagan, he tapped into those too. The people who felt like the country's values were changing too fast.
Yeah.
Things like race relations, gender roles.
It was a backlash, Some call it the white backlash.
Interesting.
And Reagan, he didn't exactly come out and say he agreed with those racist views, but his rhetoric, his talk about things like states' rights and crime, it really resonated with those who felt threatened by all the progress of the civil rights movement.
So he was playing to those fears.
He was. And then there was the religious right. He really brought them into the fold.
Even though he wasn't known for being all that religious himself, was he?
Not really, but he was a pragmatist. Right?
Yeah.
He saw how powerful the evangelical Christians were becoming.
They were a force to be reckoned with.
They were. And he embraced their concerns about things like abortion, school prayer, the erosion of family values, as they call it. It was all part of building that conservative coalition that brought him to power.
Right. So Reagan rides this wave of discontent all the way to the White House in 1980.
Yeah.
But even with the hostages home, the Iran situation, it was just the tip of the iceberg for Reagan when it came to foreign policy challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, he was really tough on the Soviet Union, called them the evil empire.
He did. It was a big departure from the whole détente thing that Nixon and Ford had been trying to do.
Right. So basically, he declared a new Cold War.
Kind of, yeah. He really believed that the Soviets were an existential threat to the U.S. and the whole free world. So he ramps up military spending, starts supporting anti-communist groups all over the place in Afghanistan, Nicaragua.
He was sending a message.
He was. And it definitely escalated tensions with the Soviets. And that brings us to one of the most controversial chapters of his presidency, the Iran-Contra affair.
Oh, man, Iran-Contra. What a mess. Secret arms deals, hostages, funding for rebels in Nicaragua.
It was like something out of a spy novel.
Totally. Okay, so break it down for us. What actually happened?
Okay, so the Reagan administration, they secretly sold weapons to Iran, which was a big no-no, by the way, because there was an arms embargo against Iran at the time.
So we were breaking our own rules.
We were, and they did this in exchange for the release of American hostages who were being held by Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So we were negotiating with terrorists.
It was a really controversial move, to say the least. And Congress, they had specifically banned aid to Iran.
So it was illegal.
Yeah, it was. And then it comes out that the money they made from those arms sales, they were using it to fund the Contras, these anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua.
No way. So they were running this whole covert operation behind Congress's back.
Pretty much. It was a huge scandal, tarnished Reagan's image. Several members of his administration ended up being convicted of crimes related to it.
Wow. It's hard to believe he survived that politically.
It is. But somehow he remained popular. People seemed to really like him, even if they didn't always agree with his policies.
He had that Teflon thing, didn't he?
He did. He just had this way of connecting with people. He projected this optimism, this strength, and he had that folksy wisdom that a lot of Americans really responded to. And then there was his economic program, Reaganomics, which was a huge part of his appeal.
Right. Reaganomics, tax cuts, deregulation.
Exactly. It was a big shift from what had come before.
Did it work? I mean, did it actually do what it was supposed to do?
Well, that's a debate that economists are still having today.
No kidding.
The idea behind supply-side economics, as they called it, was to boost economic growth by cutting taxes and regulations. The thinking was that this would create jobs and eventually benefit everyone.
Sounds good on paper, but did it work out that way in real life?
It's a mixed bag. The economy did grow in the 80s, but the gap between the rich and the poor, that grew too.
So some people benefited more than others.
They did. And the national debt, well, that went through the roof under Reagan.
So a mixed bag on the economic front. What about the Cold War? I mean, did Reagan's hardline stance actually contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union?
That's a tough question. It's hard to say for sure what role he played. The Soviet Union was already in trouble. Stagnant economy, corruption, unrest in the Eastern Bloc countries.
So they were already on shaky ground.
They were. But Reagan's military buildup and his rhetoric, the evil empire stuff, that definitely put pressure on them.
Yeah, it sent a clear message.
It did. And then you had Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power in the mid-'80s. He was a reformer, started these reforms, glasnost and perestroika, to open up Soviet society and restructure the economy.
Gorbachev was different, wasn't he?
He was. And he and Reagan, they actually developed a pretty good relationship, which was pretty surprising after all the hostility. They started negotiating arms control treaties, easing tensions.
So a combination of internal problems and external pressure from Reagan.
It's probably the most accurate way to put it. And ultimately, it all led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Cold War was over.
The end of an era.
It really was. And suddenly the U.S. was the only superpower left standing.
A whole new world.
Exactly. But even with the Cold War over and the economy showing some signs of life, Reagan wasn't able to get everything he wanted done. I mean, he was conservative, but he didn't achieve all his goals.
What do you mean?
Well, he faced a lot of opposition from the Democrats in Congress. Some of his biggest goals, things like overturning Roe v. Wade,
Right.
never happened. And even though he wanted to shrink the government, the welfare state, that pretty much stayed in place.
So Reagan's legacy, it's kind of complicated, isn't it?
It is. He energized the conservative movement, changed the political landscape, played a role in ending the Cold War. But he also left behind a lot of problems, rising inequality, a huge national debt.
And those problems, well, they didn't just disappear when he left office.
No, they didn't. And his successor, George H.W. Bush, he had to deal with the fallout. And he had to navigate this new world order that was emerging after the Cold War.
Okay, so last time we left off with Reagan riding off into the sunset, leaving behind a pretty mixed legacy.
Yeah, a lot of highs and lows.
Definitely. So now we're moving into the Bush era. George H.W. Bush. I mean, he had some big shoes to fill, right?
He did. It's tough to follow an icon like Reagan. And the world, it was changing so fast after the Cold War.
It was like a whole new ball game. So how did Bush try to position himself?
Well, he campaigned on continuing Reagan's legacy, but he also wanted to soften the edges a bit,
Like a kinder, gentler conservatism.
Exactly. He was trying to appeal to those who liked the direction the country was going in, but maybe felt like Reagan was a little too, ideologically driven.
Too hardline.
Yeah, something like that. But that approach, it didn't really sit well with everyone in his own party.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that. Some Republicans thought he wasn't conservative enough.
They did. The hardliners, they saw him as too moderate, not a true believer in the Reagan Revolution.
So he had to deal with those divisions within his own party right from the start.
He did. And then there was Congress. The Democrats controlled both houses.
Right. So even if he wanted to push through a conservative agenda, he didn't really have the votes.
Exactly. And made it tough to get anything done. And then, of course, there was the economy.
Always the economy.
Always. And Bush, he inherited a pretty sizable deficit from the Reagan years.
Reaganomics, for all its successes, did leave behind a lot of red ink.
It did. And then the economy dipped into a recession during Bush's term.
Uh-oh. Not good.
Not good at all. And it forced him to make some really unpopular decisions.
Like raising taxes.
Yeah, like breaking his no new taxes pledge.
That was a huge deal. I remember that. It really alienated a lot of conservatives.
It did. They felt like he'd betrayed them. But Bush, he felt like he had no choice. He had to do something about the deficit.
It was a tough spot to be in. So, a shaky economy, a divided party, it wasn't looking good for Bush. But then you had the Persian Gulf War. That seemed to turn things around, at least for a while.
The Gulf War, that was a big moment for Bush. In 1990, Saddam Hussein, he invades Kuwait. And Bush, he takes decisive action.
He really did.
He builds this international coalition and launches Operation Desert Storm to drive Iraq out of Kuwait.
Yeah, I remember watching all that unfold on TV. It was pretty intense.
It was a huge military operation, and it was a big win for the U.S. and its allies. It showed the world that America was still the top dog, the superpower.
Especially after the Cold War just ended. It was like, okay, the U.S. is still calling the shots.
Exactly. And Bush's approval ratings, they went through the roof, but it didn't last.
No.
Nope. The economy was still sputtering, and a lot of people, they felt like Bush was out of touch with their struggles.
Right, because even with a big win like the Gulf War, people still care about what's happening in their own lives, in their own wallets.
Absolutely. And in the end, it wasn't enough to save him. He lost the 1992 election to Bill Clinton.
Clinton really tapped into that economic anxiety. It's amazing how even a major foreign policy victory can be overshadowed by domestic concerns.
It happens all the time. But, stepping back and looking at this whole period we've been talking about, from Watergate to the end of the Cold War, it's remarkable how much America changed in such a short time.
It really is. It was like a roller coaster ride through history. Scandals, economic ups and downs, that huge shift in global power dynamics, and of course, that rise of conservative politics that completely reshaped the country.
It did. And it's amazing how so many of the debates we're still having today, they have roots in this era. The role of government, social programs, foreign intervention, the whole question of individual liberty versus the common good.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through such a fascinating and consequential period in American history. And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and never stop learning from the past.